A single dad helped a female soldier in the rain. Then she got a letter that changed everything. The rain had been falling for hours, thick and heavy like it meant to scrub the world clean. It drummed on the motel sign above Madison Greer's head, each drop cold enough to bite through her uniform, soak her skin, and settle into her bones. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay upright as the wind whipped at her wet hair. The glassy-eyed clerk behind the reception desk barely looked up as he handed her back her military ID. "No card, no room. Sorry, ma'am." His voice had all the warmth of the weather. Madison tucked the ID back into the inside pocket of her jacket and took a breath that trembled as it left her. She didn't argue, didn't beg. She just stepped back outside into the rain. Her duffel bag dragged against the pavement as she moved toward the road. Her boots were caked in slush, shoulders bowed under exhaustion, her breath fogging in the autumn chill. She'd tried 3 different places in the last 2 hours, and they'd all said the same thing. No vacancy, no cash accepted, no sympathy. The street was empty. The town was asleep. No headlights, no buses, no cabs. Just the rain and her. A neon open sign flickered in a convenience store across the street, but she didn't have the energy to cross. Her legs had started to cramp the duffel strap digging into her shoulder like a punishment. A part of her, the small stubborn corner that had carried her through 14 years of service, kept walking anyway. 1 more block. 1 more mile. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe a pair of headlights cut through the downpour behind her. She didn't turn around at first. Cars had passed her for the last half hour, ignoring the uniform, the soaked pack, the way she stood like someone with nowhere left to go. But this one slowed. The engine idled behind her. She turned slowly, rain streaming down her face. The truck was old, dented, reliable. The kind of truck a man owns for 20 years and fixes himself. The window rolled down halfway and a man leaned out, late 30s, maybe 40, a square jaw and dark, tired eyes under a damp baseball cap. "You need a ride?" he asked, voice low even. Madison didn't answer right away. She glanced at his hands. They were rough, calloused. Working hands. No twitchiness. No weapons. No flashing smile that meant something else. Just eyes that saw her, not a uniform, not a problem. Just her. Still she hesitated. "I'm not going far," he added. "But there's a diner a few blocks down. It's open late. You can dry off, get warm." The wind cut through her soaked clothes again, and that was answer enough. She nodded once and opened the door. The warmth hit her like a wave, stale coffee and motor oil, but better than the rain. She climbed in, closed the door, and settled the duffel on her lap like a shield. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. Just the swish of the windshield wipers and the hum of the engine. The truck creaked with every bump in the road. A stuffed dinosaur swung from the rearview mirror, its stitching worn its tail half unraveled. She looked at him sideways. He didn't glance back. "You military?" he asked, still facing the road. "I was," she said, then corrected herself. Technically, Army, yeah." He nodded like he already knew. "I used to be a medic, Navy corpsman, Iraq." She blinked at him, surprised. He didn't look like it. But then neither did she anymore. "You out now?" she asked. "Long time. Got a kid now. Keeps me grounded." They reached the diner, a squat building with a flickering sign and glowing windows. It looked like a postcard from 30 years ago, cheap pie-hot coffee and nobody asking questions. He pulled into the lot and turned off the ignition. Madison reached for the door handle, but he stopped her. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. She shook her head. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded 20, then opened the glove box and handed her a motel key. "Room 4. Cheap keychain. Plastic tag." "I keep a room at that place near the tracks," he said. "Sometimes for guys coming out of detox. Sometimes for someone who just needs it. You can crash there. No strings." Madison stared at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because someone once did it for me." She took the keys slowly, like it might disappear. "You hungry?" he asked. She started to shake her head, but her stomach answered for her. He smiled just a little. Let's get something warm then. Inside the diner, the waitress knew him, called him Luke, told him Ellie missed him tonight. He smiled, said he'd read her the bedtime story twice to make up for it. They sat in a booth by the window, steam curling from mugs of coffee between them. Madison stared at her reflection in the glass. Wet hair, red eyes, a woman on the edge, and realized it was the first time all day someone had looked at her like she wasn't broken. Luke didn't pry. He just ate his pie and offered her his half. She took it. When he dropped her off at the motel, she paused before getting out. "Thanks," she said. He nodded. "Get some rest." She walked to the room key, clenched in hand. But before going inside, she glanced back. The truck was still there, headlights glowing dimly through the mist like he was waiting to make sure she'd made it in. She didn't wave. He didn't need it. But she stood in the doorway a long time, holding the key and thinking about how long it had been since someone stopped in the rain, and how sometimes it was enough to change everything. The motel room was barely bigger than a storage unit, with one flickering overhead light and the faint scent of mildew soaked into the walls. But to Madison, it felt like sanctuary. She peeled off her wet uniform with shaking hands and sank into the creaky mattress without even pulling back the covers. Her boots sat by the door, dripping quietly onto the mat. Her duffel bag rested beside them, everything she owned compressed into canvas and memory. Sleep came in fragments. Rain tapped at the window all night like it had something urgent to say. In her dreams, faces blurred people she'd served with people she couldn't save, people she tried not to remember. A door slammed somewhere down the hall and she jolted upright, heart pounding as if she were back in uniform, crouched behind sandbags waiting for orders that never came. When the sun finally rose pale and watery behind the clouds, Madison lay still for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling. She'd survived Warzone's tribunal's betrayal, but somehow, waking up alone without purpose, without orders, this was harder. She reached for the folded motel key still on the nightstand and held it in her palm. It wasn't the room that mattered. It was the man who'd handed it to her without question. Luke. Just a name spoken once by the waitress. A man with quiet eyes, a little girl who missed bedtime stories, and a truck full of silence and warmth. She checked out of the motel 2 hours later. The clerk didn't recognize her. "Guy who paid for it, he come here often?" she asked. The clerk shrugged. "Sometimes. He drops off the envelopes. Pays in advance for strangers. Don't talk much. How do you reach him?" "You don't?" That was that. Madison stepped back out into the gray morning, her duffel slung across her back. She should have left it there, chalked it up to kindness from a stranger, and moved on. But something itched in her chest. Something unfinished. Something like hope. She headed toward the diner. The bell over the door jingled when she stepped inside. The place was mostly empty this early, save for a couple of elderly men reading newspapers and a teenager scrolling on his phone behind the counter. The same waitress from the night before appeared with a coffee pot and a warm smile. "Back already? Hungry looking for someone?" Madison said. "Luke." The waitress paused, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You a friend? I'm trying to be." She studied Madison for a moment longer, then nodded. "You just missed him. Works morning shifts 2 blocks over church maintenance. Try St. Joseph's. He's always early." The church loomed modestly at the edge of town, its stone steeple gray against the thick clouds. It wasn't fancy, but it had a quiet dignity, much like the man Madison hoped to find. She spotted him before he noticed her kneeling beside a flower bed, hands caked in damp soil. Sleeves rolled up his flannel shirt, stained with work and time. He was humming something low and tuneless. Madison stood at the gate for a moment, unsure what to say. Then he looked up, saw her, and nodded like he'd been expecting her all along. "You found the place," he said. "I wasn't sure if I should." Luke stood brushing his hands on his jeans. "If you had nowhere else to be, then, yeah, you should." She smiled faintly, arms crossed against the chill. "You help a lot of people, don't you?" He shrugged. "Used to need a lot of help myself." There was no pride in his voice, just truth. Madison followed him as he walked toward the side of the church where a rusted storage shed leaned wearily against the brick wall. He opened it and pulled out a set of tools, handing her a wrench without asking. "If you're staying, you might as well earn your keep." She grinned. Subtle. They worked in silence, fixing the broken hinges on a warped door, reattaching gutter brackets. Her hands remembered how to be useful. It felt good. Grounding. For the first time in weeks, the buzzing in her head dulled. Afterward, they sat on the back steps of the church, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. "I used to be someone," she said quietly. "You still are." She didn't reply. Just watched the steam rise from her cup like smoke from a fire long burned out. "I'm not going to ask why you were walking in the rain," Luke said after a while. "But I know that kind of silence, the kind you wear like armor." Her eyes filled unexpectedly. She looked away. "I'm not used to people seeing through it." "Maybe you've been around the wrong people." She wanted to say something sharp, something defensive, but instead she just nodded. Luke stood, stretched, and pulled something from his pocket. It was a folded photograph, frayed at the edges. He handed it to her without explanation. In the picture, a young Luke smiled awkwardly, wearing fatigues, standing beside another man, taller, darker, laughing with an arm slung around Luke's shoulders. "My brother in arms," Luke said, "didn't make it home. I tried to save him. I didn't." Madison stared at the photo, her throat tightening. "I know that weight," she whispered. He nodded. "Then you know why I stop when I see someone in the rain." She held the picture with reverence, then handed it back. "You did more than stop," she said. "You made me feel human again." Luke said nothing, just nodded and pocketed the photo. As Madison walked away, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp leaves and earth. She didn't know where she was going yet, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid to find out. In her pocket, the motel key still rested like a promise. And behind her, Luke returned to the flowers, humming again, planting seeds he might never see bloom, but planting them anyway. The envelope was thick, stamped, sealed, and oddly formal, even by military standards. Madison found it wedged between junk mail and a pamphlet about veteran health services when she checked the small rusted mailbox at the transitional housing facility. She had only given out the address once to complete the paperwork for her upcoming administrative hearing. She tore the envelope open with her thumb, bracing herself for more bureaucracy, another form to complete another question, to defend another delay in the decision that would determine whether she received full veteran benefits or nothing at all. But the moment she read the first line, her breath caught. Supplemental testimony submitted. In support of subject Madison Greer, Lieutenant, retired. She blinked hard, reading the name again. Then again. It was real. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she scanned further. The language was formal government speak, dry and deliberate, but the content hit her like a sudden gust of wind. A man named Luke Harrison had submitted a first-hand account detailing a firefight in Fallujah, 2009. He had not been present during Madison's recent case, but his testimony tied to a separate but related incident years ago validated the pattern she had reported: repeated negligence of protocol by a high-ranking officer who now stood at the center of her tribunal. Luke's statement was calm, clear, and detailed, and deeply personal. "I don't know Lieutenant Greer beyond a brief meeting," he wrote, "but I've seen this before. I've carried the guilt of silence. If she has the courage to speak, then the least I can do is tell what I know." Madison sank onto the edge of her bed, hands trembling. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too sharp. She hadn't asked him. She hadn't even told him her full name. But he'd remembered. Somehow, in that short ride in that cold diner booth, he'd seen enough to believe her. Enough to risk being pulled into a system he had long since walked away from. And he'd done it anyway. The next day, Madison stood before the panel. 3 high-backed chairs, a long table, files and laptops, cold faces with warm words that didn't mean much. They asked her the same questions again. She gave the same answers. But this time, This time, she wasn't alone. They acknowledged the supplemental testimony. Not just acknowledged it, changed the tone in the room. The woman in the center, a colonel with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone, flipped through Luke's statement twice. Her voice softened. "You have someone speaking for you, Lieutenant? That doesn't happen often." Madison sat a little straighter. When it was over, they told her they would reach a decision within 2 weeks. She nodded, saluted, and walked out into the sunlight. The sky was finally clear. She didn't go back to her room, didn't feel like hiding between 4 cinder-block walls. Her feet led her down familiar sidewalks past brick buildings and faded flags until she found herself at the little diner again. The bell jingled when she walked in. The same waitress looked up from pouring coffee. "He's not here right now, honey," I know Madison replied. "I just needed to sit somewhere warm." The waitress gave her a look something between understanding and permission, then slid a coffee across the counter. "It's on the house." Madison sipped it slowly, letting the steam rise into her face. Then she pulled a folded note from her jacket. Not an official document. Just a thank you letter. Personal. Honest. She had written it 3 times and torn it up each time. This version she kept. An hour later, she walked back to the church. The back gate was open. The leaves had started to turn the first golds and ambers of a slow-coming fall scattered along the gravel path. Luke was fixing a section of chain-link fence behind the playground. His jacket hung on a post, and Ellie, his daughter, sat cross-legged on a picnic bench nearby, drawing with markers on a notepad. When she saw Madison, her face lit up. "Dad, it's the rain lady." Luke looked up, a wrench still in hand. "Madison," she offered a sheepish wave. "Your daughter's got a good memory." Ellie held up a drawing. "It's you. I drew your army jacket and your boots. Want it?" Madison knelt down, touched by the simple gesture. The picture was crude but sweet, her under a gray sky, a stick figure in camouflage, smiling faintly. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He didn't ask why she was there. She handed him the letter. "I didn't know how else to say thank you," she said, "but I wanted you to know what your words did." He took the note but didn't open it, just tucked it into his back pocket like it was something sacred. "I meant them," he said simply. "I know." A beat of silence passed. Wind rustled through the playground slide. Birds chirped as if the world had decided to start singing again. "I didn't think anyone would stand up for me," Madison admitted. "Not after all this time. Not someone who didn't even know me." "I didn't need to know," Luke said. "I've seen enough to recognize the look in someone's eyes when they're carrying more than they should." He paused, then added quietly, "I know what it's like to speak out too late." Madison looked at him, then not as a stranger who'd offered kindness in the rain, but as a man with his own scars, his own ghosts. And something else, the quiet strength of someone who decided to keep showing up even when no one was watching. "Sometimes late is still right on time," she said. Ellie ran up and took her hand. "Want to stay for dinner?" Luke hesitated. "Only if you're not in a hurry." Madison smiled. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't. And in that small moment, under an open sky with leaves beginning to fall, 3 people sat on a porch with spaghetti and lemonade. And not a single one of them was alone. There were certain silences. Madison had grown used to those heavy leaden ones that settled between soldiers who'd seen too much. The kind that didn't require words because everyone already understood. But the silence between her and Luke was different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't cold, it was steady, like the quiet hum of an engine that never failed to start. Like safety. That night after dinner, as Ellie curled up on the couch in her pajamas watching an old cartoon on low volume, Madison and Luke stood in the kitchen side by side rinsing dishes. The simplicity of it felt almost sacred. 2 adults sharing space, not in a rush to fill it with small talk or retreat into solitude. "You always cook that much spaghetti?" Madison asked, nudging him with her elbow. Luke half smiled. Occupational hazard. Grew up in a big family. Cooking less than 5 servings feels unnatural. She looked at him, then really looked at him, not just the tired eyes or the faint scar near his temple, but the quiet lines of someone who'd lived hard and chose to keep loving anyway. "Were they all like you?" she asked. He paused for a beat, drying his hands. "Some better, some worse. I was the one who left and didn't come back until too much had changed." There was no bitterness in his voice, just fact, just history. Madison leaned against the counter. "You ever talk about what happened over there?" Luke shook his head. "Not unless it helps somebody else." She understood that, understood it too well. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded paper yellowed at the corners. Carefully he opened it and laid it on the table. It was a photo, Luke and another soldier arms slung around each other laughing in desert sun. "That's Mason," he said quietly. "He didn't make it home. Got hit in an IED blast while we were transporting wounded." Madison sat slowly, her breath catching. She'd seen so many of these pictures, smiling faces, frozen in time, men and women who wouldn't get a second chapter. "I was the one driving," Luke said. "We were supposed to rotate, but I told him to rest. I thought—" He stopped the words, cracking mid-sentence. "You thought you were protecting him," Madison finished gently. He nodded. "Instead, I gave him the front seat." Silence again, but not empty. Charged. Deep. "I carry a list in my head," Madison said after a moment. "Names, faces, birthdays. Things I should have done differently." Luke looked up. "You too, doesn't everyone?" He shrugged. "Some people bury it. Some drink it away. I fix fences and feed people I'll never see again." Madison reached for the photo, traced the corner. "Do you ever feel like you're making up for something you can't fix?" Luke met her gaze. "Every day." And just like that, something inside her shifted. Not broken, not cracked, but opened. A door long sealed shut. The next morning, Madison visited the Community Resource Center, where she'd once attended a job readiness seminar she barely remembered. This time, she wasn't just passing through. She filled out an application for a part-time program assisting veterans with reintegration, something Maria Torres had mentioned in passing weeks ago, but Madison hadn't been ready for then. Now, she was. Afterward, she returned to the church not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. Luke was out back again this time, repairing a swing set. The metal frame, rusted but sturdy. "Need a hand," she called. He didn't look surprised to see her, just passed her a wrench like it was the most natural thing in the world. As they worked, he nodded toward Ellie, who was on the steps coloring. "She's why I didn't spiral after I got out," he said softly. "When you've got someone depending on you, it changes the way you process pain." Madison tightened a bolt. "You ever feel like you're just barely holding things together? Only on the days that end in E." She laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Later, as they packed up the tools, Luke said, "You know, there's something I didn't tell you." Madison raised a brow. "That's ominous." He hesitated. "I didn't plan to testify. I didn't even know your full name until I heard the girl at the diner call you Lieutenant. I recognized the unit. Looked it up. What you were doing. It hit me." Madison waited, heart stilled. "You were trying to say what I never could, what I should have said when it was my turn." He met her eyes then, and there was nothing performative in it. No savior complex, no dramatic flair. Just a man who once walked away from his own truth and saw someone brave enough to do what he hadn't. "I didn't want to fail you too," he added. Madison felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. Not from guilt. Not even from sorrow. But from something deeper being seen. "I didn't think anyone noticed," she whispered. "I noticed," Luke said, "and I wasn't the only one." That night, as she walked back to her room under a cloud-streaked sky, Madison stopped at a mailbox on the corner. She held an envelope in her hand, a letter addressed not to an office or an appeal board, but to someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time, her younger brother Sam. He'd served, too. left the military years before her. They hadn't spoken since the day she blew the whistle. He'd thought it was a betrayal, that she should have kept quiet. But now she wanted him to know she didn't walk away, and neither did the man who stood with her when she didn't even know she needed it. She slid the letter into the box, exhaled slowly, and looked up. Above her, the clouds had parted just enough to show a single shining star. Not much, but just enough. The next Saturday morning was soft and golden, the kind of autumn day that made you believe the world hadn't given up on beauty just yet. Sunlight filtered through amber leaves as Madison walked up the cracked walkway to Luke's modest home. The porch creaked as she stepped onto it. For the first time in a long while, her heart was oddly light. She wasn't sure if she was visiting as a friend or just someone trying to hold on to what made her feel steady. The screen door opened before she could knock. Ellie stood there, all gap-toothed grin and sleepy eyes, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and socks that didn't match. She didn't say hi or ask why Madison was there. She simply said, "You're just in time. We haven't started the pancakes yet." Madison blinked. That's very specific hospitality. Ellie shrugged. Dad always says people come back when they feel safe. Luke appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a towel, his hair still wet from the shower. "She's not wrong," he said, smiling. It was the first time Madison had seen him relaxed, unburdened by a wrench or a story. Just a man in his home on a Saturday flipping pancakes for a kid who still believed mornings were worth getting excited about. "You sure I'm not intruding?" Madison asked, hesitating on the step. Luke opened the door wider. "You sure you don't want blueberries in your pancakes?" That was his answer, and it was enough. They sat at the small table by the window, the kitchen warm with the smell of butter and cinnamon. Ellie chattered as she drew on the back of a grocery list, narrating a fantasy story about a brave lady soldier who built a secret treehouse for kids who had bad dreams. Madison listened with one elbow propped on the table, a smirk tugging at her lips. "She sounds like she has good taste in camouflage," she said. Ellie looked up. "You think so? I think she's kind of lonely. But she's good at pretending she isn't." Madison went still. Luke across the table didn't say a word, just glanced at his daughter, then at Madison. Children never needed to be taught how to see truth. They came with that gift. "I used to pretend a lot," Madison said, her voice low. "Still do sometimes." Ellie, unconcerned, returned to her drawing. Pretending is okay as long as someone notices you're doing it. The words landed like a stone in Madison's chest softly and all at once. She looked at Luke. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. Later, Ellie tugged Madison outside to the small backyard, which was more weeds than grass, but charming in its own unruly way. A half-built treehouse stood off-center near the back fence, its wooden frame still raw and unfinished. "We started this last year," Ellie said, pointing up. "But Dad got too busy. He said one day we'll finish it when life slows down." Madison squinted up at the structure. "You think it ever will slow down?" Ellie asked. Madison nodded. "Nope," Ellie said cheerfully, "but we can still finish the treehouse anyway." It was the kind of logic only a child could deliver, and somehow it made more sense than anything Madison had heard in months. "I think we can work with that," she murmured. She stepped back and surveyed the project. "You got a hammer." Ellie grinned and darted toward the shed. Luke walked out onto the porch just as Madison rolled up her sleeves. "I'm not sure you know what you're signing up for." "I built field barracks in monsoons," Madison said. "I think I can handle a treehouse." Luke tilted his head. "You're sure this isn't a tactical excuse to spend your Saturday with us, maybe? But at least I brought my own boots." They worked all afternoon, taking turns sawing, drilling balancing beams, while Ellie offered detailed architectural advice from the ground. Madison hadn't used her hands like this in years, not for anything that didn't involve signing forms, filling reports, or holding on through the night. As she drilled the last bolt into a crossbeam, she felt something inside her settle. A rhythm, a sense of place. It wasn't about building something tall or grand. It was about building something that didn't need to be perfect, only present. just like people. By late afternoon, they sat on the porch steps with lemonade and tired arms. Ellie had passed out inside, curled up with her drawing pad still in hand. "She draws you a lot," Luke said. Madison chuckled. "I noticed. She told me last week that you reminded her of a hawk. Serious, strong kind of quiet, but always watching." Madison laughed softly. "That might be the best compliment I've ever gotten." Luke looked at her then, not just across the porch, but into her. The way people do when they've stopped being afraid to ask the questions that matter. "You ever think about staying?" The words hung in the air. Madison didn't flinch. "Sometimes," she said. "But I don't know if I know how." "You learn by trying," he said. "Same way you learn how to hold a hammer or read a kid's mind." She looked out over the yard, the treehouse standing proudly in the late light. "Maybe it's not about staying," she said slowly. "Maybe it's about choosing where to return to." Luke nodded. "That's a good place to start." As the sun dipped below the trees and evening stretched out over the quiet neighborhood, Madison felt a peace she hadn't trusted in years. Not because everything was perfect, not because her past was erased or her future guaranteed, but because for once someone had noticed she was pretending, and simply chose to stay. Not to fix her, just to build something beside her, even if it started with a crooked treehouse and blueberry pancakes. By the time Madison stepped into the low-slung brick building labeled Veteran Resource and Renewal Center, the scent of brewed coffee and dry paper filled the air. It wasn't warm in the cozy sense more institutional lined with posters about PTSD workshops and nutrition, but it was familiar. Predictable. Safe. She stood just inside the doorway watching a group of 5 men and women gathered around a long table listening intently to a petite woman in her 50s with short silver-streaked hair and a clipboard. She was mid-sentence but paused when she noticed Madison. "You must be Lieutenant Greer," the woman said with a nod of recognition. "Maria Torres." Maria walked over her presence, calm but commanding, the kind of person who didn't need volume to be heard. Her handshake was firm and her eyes, clear, intelligent, missed nothing. "We've been following your hearing," Maria said without preamble. "I've read your reports. What you did was brave." Madison offered a polite smile. "Some people would say it was reckless." Maria returned a knowing look. "Usually the ones it exposes." Madison exhaled softly. "I'm not here for congratulations. I'm just trying to figure out where I fit now. You and half the people in this building." Maria gestured for her to follow. "Come, sit in for the second half of today's workshop. No pressure to speak. Just observe." They entered the back of the room. A circle of veterans sat, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, all bearing the quiet exhaustion of people who had returned from something no one else could see. Their faces were lined with years, stories, guilt, strength. Madison knew those expressions intimately. "Today's topic is re-entry identity," Maria continued. "Who you were in service, who you think you're supposed to be now, who you're allowed to become." One man spoke up first, maybe 50 hands, rough knees, bouncing with nervous energy. "I feel like I was important once. Now I just get in the way at the grocery store." A woman added, "I can't even sleep next to my husband anymore." He breathes too softly. "I wake up thinking I've lost someone." Heads nodded, murmured agreements, and then a long silence. Maria turned to Madison. Lieutenant Madison stiffened slightly. She hadn't planned to talk, but the eyes around the room weren't demanding, just hopeful. She cleared her throat. "I used to know exactly who I was. And then one day I said something that changed everything. I stood up for what I believed in, and lost my career, most of my friends, and a sense of belonging. Some days I wonder if it was worth it." No one interrupted. Madison continued. "But a stranger stopped in the rain one night. He didn't know me, didn't ask what I'd done. He just saw I was tired and wet and alone. And for the first time in months I didn't feel invisible. The room was still. It reminded me that the uniform wasn't the only thing that made me worth saving. Maria, her voice soft, said, "That's the kind of reminder most of us need." After the session, Madison stepped into the hallway emotionally drained but strangely lighter. Maria walked beside her. "I'd like you to consider joining our peer support facilitation program," she said. "You've got experience. And, more importantly, you've got presence." Madison raised an eyebrow. "Presence. People listen when you speak, because you only speak when it matters." Madison laughed under her breath. "I've been accused of being too quiet." "Then let me reframe it," Maria said. "You don't waste air. That's rare." Madison didn't give her answer right away, but something inside her already knew. That evening, Madison made her way back to Luke's place. She hadn't called ahead. Somehow, she didn't think she had to. The porch light was already on when she arrived. Ellie was lying on her stomach in the living room drawing what looked like a castle with antennas. Luke sat on the couch reading an old paperback glasses sliding halfway down his nose. When Madison stepped inside, Ellie looked up and announced, "I drew you again." Madison laughed. "Oh, what am I doing this time?" Ellie held up the picture. It was a stick figure version of Madison standing in front of a classroom of other stick figures, all of them smiling. "You're helping the ones with invisible OEs," she explained. "Like Daddy's shoulder, but in their heads." Madison blinked. Luke set his book aside. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. I think I might have found something today. Or maybe it found me." He waited. I was in a room full of people carrying things no one else could see, and they weren't pretending they were fine. I didn't either, and it felt honest. Luke's voice was steady. "That's more rare than you think." She walked over to the couch, sat beside him. "Maria thinks I could help. Not with answers, just by being there. Holding space." Luke smiled. "Funny. That's how I see what I do every day. I don't fix the fence so people stop falling down. I fix it so they know someone still cares if they fall." Madison looked at him. "You think I can do that too. I think you've already started." Much later that night, as Luke tucked Ellie into bed, she whispered something that made him pause. "Daddy." "Yeah. When people help, does that make them family?" He smiled and brushed her hair back. "Sometimes, yeah. The best kind. The kind you choose." Ellie yawned. "Then I think Madison's family." Luke didn't answer right away, just kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp. In the hallway, Madison waited, eyes misty. She'd heard it. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop," she said softly. "I'm glad you did." They stood there in the half-light, something unsaid, lingering between them. Not romantic, not quite, at least not yet, but real, rooted, growing. Because sometimes when the rain doesn't choose sides, neither do the people who reach out their hands. And Madison was starting to believe. Maybe she'd been chosen too. The sky darkened faster than usual that Wednesday, as if the clouds themselves were remembering something heavy. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, whistling through the gutters like a warning. Madison stared out the window of the community center, watching leaves swirl across the parking lot. She was supposed to lead her first peer support session that evening. Maria had told her she was ready. The veterans trusted her. She'd earned this moment, but she couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. Something was wrong. An hour later at Luke's house, the phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter. Luke silenced it with a sigh. He was standing over the stove, stirring a pot of soup with one hand, rubbing his temples with the other. Ellie lay on the couch, pale and groggy cheeks flushed with fever. He'd already called off his shift at the church and the part-time night job he'd recently picked up to cover repairs on the truck. He couldn't afford to miss it, but Ellie came first. Always had. He placed a damp cloth across her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open. "Are you staying?" she mumbled. "Of course I'm staying," he whispered, brushing her hair back. "I'm right here." She nodded sleepily, her little hand curling around his finger. At the same moment, Madison pulled into the driveway with 2 paper bags balanced in her arms. She had picked up groceries after her orientation milk tea children's medicine and Luke's favorite instant coffee. She hadn't planned to stay, but something told her he might need backup. The door creaked open before she could knock. Luke looked exhausted, his flannel sleeves rolled up the worry plane in the lines around his eyes. She, "Okay," Madison asked, gently stepping in. "She's burning up," he said. "I've been giving her fluids, but her breathing's shallow. If it doesn't break by morning, we'll need to go in." Madison set the bags down and knelt beside Ellie, touching the girl's clammy skin. "Let me help," she said softly. "You look like you haven't slept since last year." Luke didn't argue. He just sat heavily at the kitchen table, eyes distant, hand pressed to the back of his neck like he was holding himself together by instinct alone. As the rain began to lash against the windows, Madison made tea and brought him a cup. He stared into it like it held some kind of answer. "She's all I've got," he said finally, voice rough. "I know," Madison said. "No, I mean she's all I've got. There's no backup plan. No family to call. No one to take her if something happens to me. If I fall apart, you won't." He looked at her hollow and bare. "I can't afford to." Madison sat across from him, steady and firm. "Then let me be the part you lean on." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to." "Maybe not," she said, "but you stopped for me in the rain. You didn't have to then, either." Silence. Then, almost too softly to hear, he murmured, "I'm scared." Madison reached across the table, her hand closing over his. "You don't have to be. Not alone." The night deepened. Thunder rolled low across the hills. Madison stayed. She helped Luke sponge Ellie's forehead, read her books aloud when she stirred, and sat with Luke through the long stretches of quiet. At 2 a.m., the fever finally broke. Ellie, still half asleep, murmured, "Did the storm go away?" Madison kissed her temple. "Not yet, sweetheart. But we're here with you." In the living room, Luke exhaled so deeply it was almost a sob. He rubbed his face and stood slowly, muscles aching from tension and hours of stillness. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to stay." "I wasn't leaving," Madison replied. And she meant it. The next morning brought a fragile calm. Sunlight broke through the clouds in streaks, drying the sidewalks and painting the wet leaves in shades of fire and gold. Ellie sat up on the couch, sipping warm broth. Madison sat beside her, gently braiding the girl's tangled hair. Luke stepped outside for a moment of air, the first he'd taken in what felt like days. When he came back in, he found Madison kneeling near Ellie's backpack, helping her sort out school papers and coloring pages. She looked up, smiled softly. "Guess I missed my session last night," she said. He tilted his head. "You led one here." She stood and brushed off her knees. "I never imagined myself part of a family again. Not like this. Not—" Quietly. Luke stepped closer. "It's not quiet. It's just not loud in the way we were trained to hear." He paused. "You could stay, you know. I mean, not permanently if you're not ready. Just longer. As long as you want." Madison looked at him. Not with fear. Not with doubt, but with the steady, measured understanding of someone who'd known battlefields of every kind and finally found one worth defending with tenderness. "I already have," she said. That afternoon, after Ellie drifted into a deep, healing sleep, Madison stepped outside. The porch was warm in the late sun. She pulled out her notebook, the one she hadn't touched in months. She opened to a blank page and wrote one line, "You don't need to be strong alone. You just need someone who won't walk away." She closed the book gently. Inside, Luke was humming a familiar tune as he washed the soup pot. There were no trumpets, no victory parades, just 2 hands moving in rhythm and the quiet hum of a house that, for the first time in a long time, felt like home. The storm had come and passed, but what stayed behind was something far more powerful. The community center was quiet that morning. No footsteps in the hall, no shuffling chairs or murmured greetings. Just sunlight filtering through the dusty blinds and the soft click of Maria's pen tapping against her clipboard. Madison sat across from her in the office, hands folded over a piece of stationery. She had borrowed it from the front desk, a plain white page with a faint navy border. No emblem, no insignia, just space. The words were already written, in ink, in her own voice. Maria hadn't asked what was in the letter. She simply said, "When you're ready." Madison wasn't sure she was, but she was here, and that had to count for something. The night before, after Luke and Ellie had gone to bed, Madison had walked out onto the porch alone. The air was cool, still carrying the scent of the storm. She sat with her knees drawn up, the notebook open in her lap, heart heavier than she'd expected. She had meant to write something simple. A thank you, perhaps. A reflection on how far she had come. But what came out was something else entirely. It started with, "To the stranger who stopped in the rain. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask what I had done or what I had lost. You only saw that I was cold-tired and human. And in a world that constantly asks us to prove our worth, that was the most radical kindness I've ever known." The rest of the letter spilled like breath slow, careful, full of things she hadn't allowed herself to say. She wrote about the day she filed her report, about the silence that followed, the colleagues who looked the other way, the commanding officer who called her emotional, the months of investigations, the nights she barely slept. She wrote about the fear that no one would ever believe her again. And then she wrote about him, Luke, how one act of decency cracked something open, how he never asked for anything in return, how Ellie's quiet acceptance healed places inside Madison that even the military couldn't reach. "You gave me shelter," she wrote, "but more than that, you gave me a reason to believe that the war I fought was not for nothing." When she finished the letter, she stared at it for a long time. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like continuation. Back in the present, Maria gestured toward the open door. "The group's starting. You still want to read it?" Madison nodded. "Yes, I think they need to hear it. I think I do." They entered the common room. A dozen veterans sat in the circle, familiar faces now. One man with a prosthetic leg balanced a cup of coffee on his knee. A woman with salt and pepper braids nodded as Madison took her seat. Maria gave her a quiet nod. It was time. Madison cleared her throat. "I wrote this last night," she said. "I didn't know I needed to until I did. It's not directed at anyone in particular, but maybe you'll see parts of yourself in it." "I know I did." She unfolded the letter and began to read. Silence settled as she spoke, not the hollow kind, but full and reverent. Madison's voice didn't shake, not from fear, but from depth. Each word landed like a soft footfall on sacred ground. When she reached the end, her final line, "I am not healed, but I am no longer invisible." There wasn't applause, there were no cheers, only the kind of stillness that meant people were listening. And one by one, veterans began to nod. The man with the prosthetic whispered, "That's the first time I've heard someone say what I've felt." Another woman reached over and touched Madison's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for carrying that until the rest of us could hear it." Maria, standing in the back of the room, blinked back something close to tears. Later, she told Madison that letter was a mirror, and for the first time some of them saw their reflection and didn't look away. That afternoon, Madison placed a copy of the letter in a sealed envelope and handed it to Maria. "For the new guys," she said, "in case they come in on a day I can't be here." Maria smiled. "You will always be here, even when you're not." Outside, the autumn wind picked up scattering leaves across the sidewalk like gold coins from a broken jar. Madison stood under the awning watching them fall. She thought about Luke, how he'd told her once that helping people wasn't about fixing them. It was about not walking away when the pain made them hard to love. She understood that now, because someone had stayed, And now, so would she. That evening, Luke was back at the church repairing a leaky pipe when Madison arrived. She didn't say anything at first, just sat on the steps watching the golden light filter through the stained glass. He joined her after a while, wiping his hands on a rag, the familiar warmth of his presence settling beside her. She pulled the original letter from her bag and handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly, reading in silence. When he finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, "You didn't have to say any of this," I know she replied, "but I wanted you to know how far one good man's choice can go." Luke looked at her. Really looked. "You're not invisible either," he said. And in that moment, no one was. Not the girl in the rain. Not the man with the wrench. Not the little girl inside sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The letter had begun in the storm, but where it ended was here, in sunlight, with hearts still mending, but no longer alone. The first frost of the season came with little warning. A thin veil of silver clung to rooftops, curled around the edges of windows, and coated the town in a soft, silent shimmer. Madison rose early, tugging on a thick sweater, her breath visible in the dim kitchen light as she poured 2 mugs of coffee, one black one with cream. Luke would be arriving soon to help prep for the veterans' morning workshop. But even before he knocked, she heard the familiar rhythm of his boots on the porch. She opened the door with a smile. "Do you ever knock?" she asked. He lifted one brow. "Would it make me more polite, or just less predictable?" She handed him the coffee. "Both." Luke stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. His cheeks were pink from the chill, his eyes a little heavier than usual. "You all right?" Madison asked, closing the door behind him. He nodded, then hesitated. "Got a letter last night." Madison set her mug down. From who Luke pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to her unsealed. Her eyes scanned the header center for veteran reintegration and community support position offer. Transitional support trainer. Her brows rose. "This is, they want me to join, full-time," Luke said. "Facilitate field workshops, train incoming volunteers, even speak on behalf of the center during community outreach events." Madison's heart jumped. "That's incredible." Luke didn't smile. I turned it down. The silence was sudden, sharp. "You what?" She said, not out of judgment, but disbelief. He ran a hand through his hair. "I've got Ellie. I've got the church work. You've got a chance to step into something bigger than you," Madison cut in gently. "You know that, right?" He looked at her. "I do, and it terrifies me." Madison sat on the armrest of the couch mug balanced on her knee. "Why?" she asked softer now. "Because I already tried being someone once. When I was a corpsman. When I thought maybe I mattered. And when I lost Mason, when I came back broken, I wasn't useful anymore. I was just a man who used to be something." She let his words hang in the air. Let the truth of them settle like dust. Then she said, "You've never stopped being someone, Luke. You just stopped believing other people needed you. But they do." "I do." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I'm not sure I know how to lead anymore," he murmured. Madison got up, walked over and placed the letter back in his hand. Then, "Do it scared." Later that week, Luke accepted the offer. Quietly, no announcement, no celebration. Just a nod to Maria across the hall, a signature on a dotted line, and the understanding that he was finally walking back into something that had once broken him with new strength, and this time not alone. Madison watched from the doorway as he met with the program director, his posture straight, his voice calm. When their eyes met across the room, he gave her the smallest smile. It was enough. The following Sunday, Ellie stood proudly beside the nearly finished treehouse as Luke fastened the final railing into place. Madison helped secure the ladder, and the 3 of them stepped back to admire their handiwork. "Looks crooked," Luke said. "Looks real," Madison replied. Ellie twirled in the grass. "It looks like it belongs here," and that Madison thought was the whole point. That afternoon they set up a small picnic beneath the tree. Ellie arranged her dolls in a perfect row. Luke brought out sandwiches and too many napkins. Madison brought the last piece of her past that needed releasing, a folded letter she hadn't shown anyone. She'd written it to herself, to the soldier version of her, to the woman who thought courage was loud and lonely. You don't have to carry the burden alone to be brave. You just have to keep showing up even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. Luke noticed the letter in her hand. "Another one?" he asked. Madison smiled. "The last one." She tucked it beneath a stone by the treehouse base. A small ritual, a quiet goodbye. That evening, as twilight softened the sky, Luke pulled a small hand-carved plaque from his truck. Madison watched as he climbed up the treehouse ladder and nailed it above the entryway. When he came down, Ellie clapped. Madison leaned in to read the inscription. "Welcome home. No more rain, no more waiting. Just wood and nails and people choosing each other again and again." Back inside, Ellie fell asleep with a flashlight in hand and her favorite book open across her chest. Madison tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Luke stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression soft. "She loves you," he said quietly. Madison turned. "I love her." Luke took a step forward. "She's not the only one." The room seemed to hold its breath, and Madison, after all she had endured, didn't step back, didn't second-guess. She simply whispered, "I know." They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something passed between them, firm, unspoken, and more real than anything that could be rushed. A promise not of perfection, but of presence. Of staying. That night, as the wind gently rustled through the trees, Madison lay awake beneath the same roof she once hesitated to enter. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers laced over her chest, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't fighting anymore. Not for validation. Not for survival. Just for joy. For peace. For the kind of love that showed up in the rain and never left. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind that stayed. The knock came just after breakfast. Not rushed, not timid. 3 firm taps on the door like someone who belonged there, even if they hadn't been there before. Madison looked up from her cup of tea still warm in her hands. Luke glanced toward the front door with a flicker of curiosity. Ellie was coloring at the kitchen table, humming softly to herself, oblivious. Luke opened the door. A sharply dressed woman in her early 40s stood on the porch. Her dark wool coat was still dusted with the last flakes of morning frost. Her clipboard was tucked against her chest, but it was the badge clipped to her lapel that caught Madison's attention. Veteran Advocacy and Outreach, National Office. "Luke Harrison?" the woman asked, glancing past him to the living room. "Yes," he said cautiously. She smiled. "You were referred by Maria Torres and the local reintegration board. May I come in?" Madison stood up instinctively. Luke stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "I'm Joanna Fields," the woman said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "I'm part of the national initiative focused on expanding local veteran programs, particularly ones led by former service members like yourself." Luke nodded once, still unsure where this was headed. "You came across our radar after submitting your testimony for Lieutenant Madison Greer," she continued, now turning toward Madison. "And then again, when you accepted a support training role. We've been reviewing your background." Madison stepped closer, protective. "Reviewing why?" Joanna smiled, unshaken. "Because we believe stories like yours, both of yours, can do more than help individuals. They can inspire reform, community action, even national dialogue." Luke's brow furrowed. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not a poster child." Joanna nodded. "That's exactly why we need you. Because you're real. Because you stopped when others didn't. Because you carry the story people need to hear." She pulled a sealed folder from her satchel and handed it to Luke. "There's a summit in Washington next month, focused on rehumanizing the reintegration process. We'd like you to join the panel. Talk about what happens after the uniform comes off. We want your voice, your experience, your integrity." Luke opened the folder slowly. Inside was a formal invitation. Reimbursement for travel. a speaking itinerary, his name printed in bold. He exhaled. "I'm a single dad. We have accommodations for families. You'd all be welcome." Joanna looked between them both. "You don't have to decide now. Just consider what a room full of decision-makers could learn from someone who chose kindness over convenience." After she left, silence filled the space. Ellie broke it first. "Does this mean we get to go to Washington like in my book report?" Madison knelt beside her. "Maybe. It's a big deal." Ellie grinned. "I could draw a map for us." Luke sat heavily on the arm of the couch, invitation still open in his hands. "I didn't ask for any of this." Madison sat beside him. "Neither did I. But that didn't stop it from finding you." He looked at her. "You think I should do it?" She hesitated, not because she doubted his ability, but because she knew what he was really asking. Could he speak about what he'd buried? Could he stand in a room full of strangers and open the door to wounds long covered? "You don't owe the world your story," she said gently. "But if you're ready, if you want to use it to build something, then maybe this is the moment that story stops being about pain and starts being about purpose." Luke looked down at the folder again. "I've spent years feeling like I didn't do enough, like kindness wasn't enough." Madison touched his hand. "But it was. It is. You changed my life, Luke, that night in the rain." That wasn't small. That was everything. They talked about it over dinner. Madison, Luke, and Ellie, who was already suggesting they visit the Lincoln Memorial and some place that sells pancakes shaped like states. By nightfall, Luke had made his decision. Not with a speech, not with fanfare, but by quietly placing the folder on the kitchen table and beginning to fill out the acceptance form. The next few weeks moved quickly. Maria helped him prep with mock interviews and presentation tips. Madison rewrote parts of his old journal entries into outlines he could draw from. Ellie designed a tiny cardboard model of the Capitol building and insisted they practice his speech beside it. And through it all, something shifted between Luke and Madison, not rushed, not dramatic, but deeply rooted. They were no longer two people orbiting the same hurt. They were becoming partners in healing. The night before they left for Washington, Madison stepped onto the porch and found Luke leaning on the railing. His arms folded, his eyes searching the stars. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She joined him, nodding. "That night, I picked you up. I almost didn't stop." She turned to him, surprised. "I saw the uniform, the soaked bag, the look on your face, and I thought, she's just like me, and if I stop, I might have to feel something again." Madison waited, heart quiet. "But I stopped, and I felt everything. And it was worth it." She reached for his hand. "I'm glad you did." They stood like that a long time, the night wrapped around them. Two people who had no intention of becoming heroes but had chosen decency when it mattered most. And now they were about to walk into a room that could echo that choice far beyond a rainy night on a lonely road. Because sometimes the knock that changes everything isn't the one on your door. It's the one you answered without expecting anything in return. And for Luke Harrison, that knock had already come. Now it was his turn to pass it forward. The stage lights were softer than Madison expected, more like a morning sun filtering through church windows than the sharp glare of a spotlight. Still, the large conference room hummed with quiet energy. Rows of listeners, veterans, counselors, lawmakers, students sat forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the man standing at the podium. Luke Harrison stood, steady hands resting lightly on the edges of the lectern. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his boots scuffed but clean. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been through it and didn't need polish to prove he mattered. Madison sat near the front, Ellie on her lap, the child unusually still. She gripped her father's dog tags in one hand, twirling them absent-mindedly as if they were a talisman. Luke cleared his throat. The microphone caught even the smallest shift in his breath. Then he began. "I never imagined I'd be here," he said. "I'm not a general, not a politician, not a decorated hero. I'm just a single dad from a small town who once forgot he had something to offer." A hush settled across the room. There was a time I thought my story ended with regret. I thought the best thing I could do for the world was stay quiet, stay small, stay out of the way. I was wrong. He paused, glancing at Madison. She gave him a quiet nod, her chest tight. Because then one night in the rain I saw someone who looked like I felt, someone carrying things the world couldn't see. And I stopped. Just that. I stopped. He looked down at the lectern, his voice thickening. And that choice, it didn't just help her, it saved me too. He straightened, hands steady again. We talk a lot about serving, about sacrifice. But I've learned something in the years since I took off. The uniform service doesn't end when you come home. Sometimes it begins again, in quieter ways, with one act of kindness, one person choosing not to walk away. A ripple of stillness spread through the room. Some blinked back tears. Others simply sat with faces turned inward as if remembering their own moment, someone who stayed, someone who saw them. Luke continued, "You don't have to fix everything. You just have to show up. For your neighbor, your daughter, a stranger on the side of the road. Because the most lasting change doesn't happen in policy, it happens in presence." And then he ended with words that no one in the audience would forget. "I didn't write a speech. I just wrote a letter once. And that letter came back to me not on paper but in the way someone chose to stay in my life. And in that staying, I found my place again." The standing ovation was slow to rise, but it rose. Not out of politeness, out of truth. Madison stood, tears in her eyes, Ellie clapping fiercely beside her. When Luke stepped off the stage, Madison met him halfway. She said nothing at first, only reached up and pulled him into a hug. A full, grounding, steady hug. "You did it," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. "No," he said. "We did." Later that evening, back in the small hotel room, Ellie fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed animal and wearing a lanyard with her VIP youth guest badge proudly displayed. Luke and Madison sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker beneath a soft navy sky. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was full, not empty. Finally, Madison reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. A fresh one, handwritten. Luke looked at it surprised. Another letter. She smiled. The last one. "This time, I'm sending it." "To who?" She turned the envelope so he could read the name. "To any soldier who thinks the battle is over when the war ends." Luke blinked. "Where's it going?" "Maria's putting together a welcome package for veterans re-entering civilian life. This'll be part of it." She exhaled. "They'll get a letter from someone who survived the silence. Someone who still believes that the rain doesn't mean the journey ends. It just makes the next step harder and more worth it." Luke reached for her hand. Their fingers twined together like it had always been meant that way. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I'm proud of us," she replied. Back home, a week later, the treehouse stood taller somehow, even though no one had touched it since they left. Maybe it was the new coat of paint Ellie had begged for. Or maybe, just maybe, it stood taller because of what had been built around it. Trust, second chances, and a kind of love that wasn't rushed but earned. Madison walked into the backyard alone that afternoon and tucked another folded note beneath the plaque Luke had carved. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. "Dear whoever you are, I hope someone stops for you. I hope someone holds the door, brings the coffee, keeps the light on. Because you matter, even when the world forgets. And when the rain comes, and it will, I hope you remember this. The people who stay. The ones who see you. They are the miracle." The rain had come, but it was no longer where her story ended. It was where it began. Single dad pulled a woman from a car wreck. She turned out to be the CEO interviewing him tomorrow. The snow was falling in thick wind-lashed sheets as Jack Carter squinted through the windshield of his aging sedan. The wipers groaned with every pass, barely keeping up. He leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the desolate stretch of road that curved along the East River under the flickering lights of the Manhattan Bridge. It was past midnight, and the city had grown quiet, at least above ground. Below, the weight of winter New York felt like it had stopped breathing. Jack's shift had ended an hour ago. He'd spent the evening repairing a busted HVAC unit at a third-rate motel that refused to heat more than one room at a time. His back ached. His fingers were cracked from the cold. And yet, he wasn't in a hurry. Emma would be asleep by now, curled up in their small one-bedroom apartment with the stuffed rabbit she refused to part with, no matter how threadbare its ears became. As he reached the bend near South Street, his headlights caught a violent flash of movement, metal snow, and glass flying in a chaotic burst. Jack slammed the brakes. His tires skidded, fishtailed, then found traction. A black SUV had crashed through the guardrail, spinning out, striking the concrete barrier hard enough to twist the frame. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood, and one tire continued to spin uselessly. "God," Jack muttered. No other cars, no voices, just the hissing and the flurry of snow that swallowed sound. Without thinking, he threw the car into park and ran. The wind ripped through his jacket. His boots crunched over ice as he crossed the distance, his breath ragged. He reached the wreck and yanked the driver's side door jammed. He darted to the passenger side and found it crumpled but not locked. Inside, a woman was slumped against the deployed airbag, blood trickling down from a gash above her eyebrow. Her chest rose and fell shallow but steady. "Hey," Jack yelled, knocking snow from his gloves and brushing hair from her face. "Hey, can you hear me?" She groaned faintly. The smoke was getting thicker. He could smell something, fuel, maybe oil. He didn't wait to confirm. Jack reached in, unbuckled her, and gently pulled her limp body toward him. She was slender, but not small, and dead weight was always heavier than it looked. Her left foot caught on the console. He tugged harder. The car groaned like something underneath was breaking. He got her out just as flames licked beneath the engine block. Snow swirled around them as he dragged her a safe distance and lowered her onto the frozen grass. His jacket came off in one motion, and he wrapped it around her as she trembled, half-conscious. "Don't move," he said gently. "Help's coming." She looked up at him with dazed, unfocused eyes. "You saved me." She whispered the words, barely audible over the wind. "What's your name?" Jack shook his head. "That doesn't matter. You're safe now." The sound of sirens approached, wailing and growing louder, bouncing off the underpass. Blue and red lights cut through the blizzard as the paramedics rushed toward them. Jack backed away. One EMT crouched beside her. "What's her name?" "Don't know," Jack replied. "She was in the wreck when I found her. You didn't call this in." He shook his head. "Didn't have time." Another medic motioned for him to get checked, but Jack raised his hands. "I'm fine," he said, already stepping back toward the road. The woman turned her head weakly in his direction. Their eyes met for just a second, hers full of pain, confusion, maybe even gratitude. But then she was surrounded by responders, and Jack Carter, quiet, invisible. Jack faded back into the darkness. 15 minutes later, he sat behind the wheel of his car again, his hands still trembling as the heater blasted warm air over his face. His jacket was gone. His shirt was damp with melted snow, but his heartbeat had finally begun to slow. He didn't know why he hadn't told them his name. He just didn't want to. It didn't feel right to make it about him. As he pulled back into the slow-moving traffic, Jack allowed himself one glance in the rearview mirror. He could still see the ambulance's flashing lights reflected in the night sky. But the woman, whoever she was gone now, and soon she would forget him too. He exhaled deeply and whispered to himself, "It's enough she's alive." What Jack didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the woman he had just saved wasn't just anyone. She was Ava Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries. And in exactly 72 hours, she would be sitting across from him in a glass-walled conference room, holding the final decision over the only job that might save his daughter's life. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, all that existed was a man who didn't walk away, and a life he refused to let slip into the dark. The knock came just after sunrise, quiet but firm. Jack Carter stirred from the worn recliner where he'd fallen asleep still in yesterday's clothes. The blanket that usually covered his legs was now wrapped around his daughter Emma, who lay curled up on the couch a few feet away. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth, her breathing soft. Jack smiled, then rubbed his eyes stiff from sleeping upright. Another knock, more insistent. He opened the door to reveal Mrs. Rivera, their elderly neighbor from across the hall, holding a small paper bag and wearing her usual mismatched cardigan and floral slippers. "I brought those cranberry muffins Emma likes," she said, brushing snow off her shoulders. "And you got a call. They left a message on my landline." Sounded important. Jack blinked. A call, which she handed him a scribbled note with a number and a name. Whitmore Industries. Some lady named Kayla. Jack's heart skipped. "Whitmore," he repeated, barely believing it. "That's what I said." She smiled kindly, then looked over his shoulder. "How's she doing?" Better Jack said. "She had a rough night. Cough wouldn't let her sleep." Mrs. Rivera nodded. "You go call them. I'll stay with Emma for a bit." Jack didn't argue. Minutes later, he was in the hallway outside, cell phone pressed to his ear, listening to a crisp voice on the other end. "Mr. Carter, this is Kayla Reynolds, executive assistant to Ms. Ava Whitmore. We'd like to invite you to interview for the facilities supervisor position. Are you available this Friday at 10 a.m.? Jack nearly dropped the phone. He had applied to Whitmore Industries months ago. It was a long shot, a top-tier company with top-tier benefits. The kind of job that came with a steady salary, health insurance, and the stability he desperately needed for Emma's treatments. But he'd heard nothing back. Not even a rejection. And now... "Yes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, I'm available." Later that day, Jack stood in the bathroom staring at his reflection. He'd shaved for the first time in weeks, trying to tame the graying stubble along his jawline. He adjusted the collar of his cleanest button-down shirt, the one he saved for church on Easter. The corners were a bit frayed, but it was the best he had. Emma sat on the edge of the bathtub, swinging her legs. "You look nice, Daddy." "Thanks, Peanut. Are they going to give you the job?" Jack crouched down beside her, smoothing her hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm going to try." She looked up at him with wide, serious eyes. "I hope they say yes. Then you don't have to work late anymore. And we can go to the aquarium." Jack smiled, swallowing the tightness rising in his throat. That's the plan. Friday arrived with icy wind and a sky heavy with clouds. Jack walked into the Whitmore building, a modern glass-paneled skyscraper in Midtown with palms damp and heart thudding. The lobby gleamed all steel and silence. Polished floors reflected overhead lights like mirrors. People in suits moved swiftly, confidently. Jack felt like he'd stepped into another world. The receptionist greeted him with a brief smile and pointed him to the 29th floor. "Miss Whitmore will see you shortly." Jack's elevator ride was silent but nerve-wracking. He rehearsed answers in his head, his experience, his skills, why he wanted the job. But as the doors opened, his thoughts fell away. The conference room was walled with glass overlooking a gray Manhattan skyline. A long table ran through the center, and at the head of it, standing tall in a slate-gray suit with a scarf wrapped lightly at her throat, was the woman from the crash. Jack froze. She was unmistakable, though her hair was neatly tied back now, and the bruise near her temple had faded to a faint shadow. She looked composed. Regal, almost. But her eyes, the same eyes he had seen wide with pain in the cold, were on him now. And they widened just slightly with recognition. A flicker passed between them. Jack blinked once, unsure if she would say anything. He half expected her to stand up and say, "You're the man who pulled me from the wreck." But she didn't. She smiled with the cool precision of a professional and gestured to the seat across from her. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, her voice like polished glass. "Thank you for coming in." Jack sat down, his heart thudding. She remembers. He could see it in her eyes. But why wasn't she saying anything? The interview began. Ava's questions were sharp-focused. She probed his knowledge of HVAC systems, electrical schematics, emergency protocols. She asked about how he would handle supply chain issues, union coordination, overnight maintenance schedules. Jack answered the best he could, drawing on years of hands-on experience. He wasn't polished. He didn't use corporate buzzwords. But his voice was steady, his answers thoughtful. What confused him was her intensity, not hostility, but curiosity. Like she wasn't just evaluating his resume. She was trying to see through him, and still not one word about that night. After 30 minutes, she closed the folder in front of her. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. We'll be in touch by Monday." Jack rose, nodded politely, and offered a tight smile. "Thank you for the opportunity." As he turned to leave, her voice followed him. "Mr. Carter." He paused. Ava tilted her head, and for the first time her voice softened. "Why did you leave before the ambulance arrived?" Jack turned slowly, puzzled. "I didn't want to be in the way." Her eyes lingered on his face. "That's rare," she said quietly. Jack held her gaze for a beat, then simply replied, "Sometimes doing the right thing means you don't need to be seen." Ava didn't answer. She simply watched as he turned again and walked out of the room. Only when the door clicked shut behind him did she finally allow herself to exhale. Yes, it was him. And somehow that changed everything. Ava Whitmore stood alone in the conference room after Jack Carter had gone, the silence folding around her like a second skin. She remained still, fingers pressed lightly to her lips, eyes lingering on the chair he had just vacated. The city, beyond the glass, seemed far away, its noise muffled by the weight of what she had just seen, what she had just confirmed. It was him, the man from the snowstorm. The man who had pulled her from the wreckage with bare hands, wrapped her in his jacket, and vanished before she could thank him. She had remembered the voice first, calm, steady, urgent. Then the eyes. Honest, steady, not asking for anything, not even a name. And now he sat across from her in a buttoned-up shirt hair, slightly unruly, answering technical questions with quiet humility. No mention of what he had done, no glint of expectation. She had built her career on instinct, reading people faster than they could read themselves. And yet this man had blindsided her. Ava exhaled, her mind buzzing with contradictions. If she acknowledged him as her rescuer, would he think she brought him here out of guilt, out of obligation? That wouldn't be fair to him or to herself. She needed time. Meanwhile, Jack stepped into the elevator with a strange mix of relief and confusion. The interview had gone better than expected, but his nerves hadn't settled. There had been something unusual in the way Ava looked at him, curious, searching. Did she know? No, he told himself. It was just coincidence. She wouldn't remember him from that night. It had been dark, chaotic. Her head was bleeding. She probably never saw his face. Still, the way she paused at the end. The question about leaving before the ambulance came. Why would she ask that he walked out of the building boots, crunching the slush on the curb, his breath fogging in the frigid air? He pulled his coat tighter. The scarf he usually wore, he realized with a quiet jolt, was still with her. He had left it wrapped around her that night. Jack smiled to himself, barely. He didn't need the scarf back. Back at the office, Ava returned to her corner suite and sat heavily behind her desk. She stared at the email draft on her screen for a full minute before deleting it entirely. Instead, she reached for her phone. "Kayla," she said when her assistant picked up. "I want a full background check on Jack Carter education, work, history, family." Quietly. There was a pause. "Is something wrong?" "No," Ava said softly. "Not wrong. Just different." That evening, Jack picked up Emma from Mrs. Rivera's apartment across the hall. She ran into his arms with a gleeful squeal, her little backpack bouncing behind her. "How'd it go?" Mrs. Rivera asked, passing him Emma's lunchbox. "I think." "Okay," Jack replied. "She didn't throw me out, so that's something." Mrs. Rivera chuckled, then gave him a look, gentle but probing. "You know, Jack, sometimes life circles back in the strangest ways." Jack furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "Just a feeling," she said, smiling as she turned back toward her apartment. "Sometimes people who show up out of nowhere, they're not really strangers." Jack held Emma's hand as they stepped into their own small apartment. Her hand was warm in his. "Did you get the job, Daddy?" "Not yet," he said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "But we might be close." She tilted her head. "If you do get it, can we get blueberry pancakes again?" "Like on your birthday." Jack laughed softly, pulling her into a hug. "Yeah, Peanut, I think we can manage that." At Whitmore Industries, Ava sat alone in her office, staring at the security camera footage from the crash site. She had acquired the recording 2 days ago from the city's traffic control center after filing a formal request. It had taken time, but she had insisted. On screen, the black SUV careened into the barrier's snow, exploding like smoke. A long moment passed. Then came the blur of movement, a man running toward the wreck. She watched it again, eyes fixed on his form as he wrenched the passenger door open and pulled her out, stumbling in the snow, wrapping her in his coat and laying her down with a gentleness she hadn't felt in years. There was something about the way he looked at her even on camera. Not pity, not awe, just purpose. Ava closed the laptop. Her heart thudded. She had made it to the top by guarding herself by believing that people always wanted something money, power, access. But Jack had walked away from her that night. He didn't know who she was. He didn't ask, and that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The following morning, Jack received an email from Whitmore Industries. He opened it with trembling fingers. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. We are pleased to move you forward to the final consideration round. Details to follow." His shoulders sagged with relief. For the first time in a long time, something had gone right. And yet, the image of Ava's eyes lingered in his mind. She knew. He could feel it. Back at Whitmore, Ava stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, arms crossed, watching the city unfurl in pale morning light. Snow had stopped. The streets below gleamed with salt and thawing ice. She tapped her fingers against her elbow, mind still restless. Jack Carter was not like the others who had passed through her company's doors, ambitious, performative, rehearsed. He was real. And she wasn't sure what to do with that. But one thing was certain, he was no longer just a name on a resume. He was the man who didn't walk away. And for reasons she couldn't explain, maybe didn't want to, she wasn't ready to walk away either. The basement of Whitmore Tower was a far cry from the executive suites above. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on rows of utility panels and boiler tanks that hummed like distant thunder. Jack stood with a wrench in one hand and a clipboard in the other, double-checking the settings on the backup generator. It had been 1 week since the interview, and Ava Whitmore had made her decision. He was hired. Just like that. No fanfare, no personal note. A formal email, crisp and direct like everything else about her. Jack hadn't seen Ava since that day in the glass-walled room. In fact, he'd barely glimpsed her at all, save for one fleeting moment in the elevator where she entered with 2 board members and didn't acknowledge him beyond the briefest of nods. And yet he could still feel her presence like static in the air. He didn't know what to make of her silence. She hadn't mentioned the night of the crash, hadn't thanked him, hadn't even hinted that she remembered. But something told Jack it wasn't forgotten. Not by her, and certainly not by him. New guy, someone called from behind. Jack turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching with a clipboard of his own and a sideways smile. "I'm Luke, head of overnight crew. You're Carter, right?" "Yeah." "Jack." Luke extended a hand. "We've heard about you." Jack raised an eyebrow. Already Luke smirked. Hard not to. "Word is, Miss Whitmore herself requested you for this role. People talk." Jack's expression remained neutral. "I just came here to do my job." Luke tilted his head, studying him. "That's rare around here. Most folks come to be seen. You just come to work." Jack gave a small shrug. "I've got a daughter. I don't have time for politics." Luke clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll fit right in with the night crew." By week's end, Jack had repaired 2 ventilation faults, reprogrammed a malfunctioning control panel, and climbed into a crawlspace to fix a burst pipe that others had avoided for months. He didn't complain. He didn't grandstand. He just did the work and did it well. But not everyone was impressed. In a high-level meeting on the 30th floor, Gregory Sloan, COO of Whitmore Industries and Ava's longtime lieutenant, slammed a folder onto the glass table. "This Carter guy," he said, voice taut. Where did he even come from? Ava, seated at the head of the table, didn't look up. He came from our applicant pool. He was qualified. He was buried in the bottom third. Gregory shot back. "You bypassed protocol. No second interview. No peer review." Why Ava finally met his gaze. "Because I saw something the system didn't." Gregory leaned forward. "You're going soft. We're heading into Q4 under pressure. This is not the time to experiment." Ava's eyes hardened. "He's not an experiment. He's a solution." Gregory leaned back, lips pursed. "He's also a wild card. Quiet types tend to have something to hide." Ava paused, voice cool. "Maybe it's that the loud ones have already shown their hands." Gregory scowled but said nothing more. He'd known Ava long enough to recognize that tone. Debate was over. Downstairs, Jack was crouched in a utility hallway checking wiring that had shorted during last night's snow. The chill from the outside seeped in through the concrete walls, but he was used to discomfort. What he wasn't used to still was the silence that followed him. It wasn't just quiet, it was intentional. People had started to notice. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered when he passed. Jack tried to shrug it off, but the feeling crawled under his skin. After hours, he asked Luke about it. "They think you're connected," Luke said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Connected." Luke nodded. "To Ava. To Sloan. To someone. Nobody comes in here and jumps protocol without strings." Jack sighed, leaning back against a panel. "I don't have strings. Just a sick kid and a second chance." Luke studied him for a long moment. "Then you better be twice as good and half as visible. They don't like what they can't explain." That night, Jack returned home just after midnight. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch again, her little body curled around the rabbit she refused to replace. He picked her up, gently, tucked her into bed, then sat on the edge of the mattress watching her breathe. There were days he felt like a ghost walking through a world that barely acknowledged him. But here, in this small apartment with its chipped paint and leaky faucet, he was still needed. Still seen. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the hospital bill he hadn't opened yet. $3,840, just for the latest round of Emma's tests. He folded it slowly, setting it aside. This job, it had to work. There was no plan B. Upstairs, Ava lingered in her office long after the building had emptied. She stood by the window watching the snow begin to fall again, softer this time. She had reviewed Jack's personnel file twice. His credentials were solid. His references glowed. But that wasn't why she'd hired him. It was what he'd done when no one was looking. She hadn't forgotten the feel of his jacket still damp with snow. Or the way he'd said, "You're safe now," like it was a promise he meant with his whole life. And he had left, without waiting to be thanked. That mattered more than any resume. Still, she had remained silent, partly out of uncertainty, partly out of fear that acknowledging what had happened might change everything, make it feel transactional. But silence had its cost. She turned from the window and looked down at her desk. On top sat a sealed envelope, an invitation to the annual corporate reception next Friday. Black tie. Dozens of eyes, and always politics. She slid it aside. Maybe it was time to disrupt the script. Maybe it was time to stop pretending that what happened that night wasn't real. Ava picked up her phone, scrolled to Jack Carter's employee file, and paused. She didn't call him. not yet. But something had shifted. Because in a world full of people fighting to be seen, she had just begun to notice the only man who wasn't trying at all. And that was precisely what made him unforgettable. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving behind a thin, glittering crust on the city's shoulders. Jack Carter stood in the modest kitchen of his apartment buttoning Emma's coat while balancing her small pink lunchbox under one arm. "You sure you're okay coming with me today?" he asked, crouching to zip her up. Emma nodded enthusiastically, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mrs. Rivera has that doctor appointment, right?" Jack smiled. "Yeah, and the sitter canceled. And I promised to be quiet like a cat," she added, miming a silent paw step. He tapped her nose gently. "I'll hold you to that." Whitmore Tower felt different when Jack entered with Emma beside him. She clutched his hand, her eyes darting from the gleaming marble floors to the elevator's glass-paneled walls, which revealed a dizzying view of Manhattan rising around them. She looked small under the fluorescent lights, her rainbow-knit hat bobbing with every step. They rode the elevator down to the facilities wing where the hum of machines and the echo of footsteps offered a strange kind of comfort. "This is where you work?" she asked in a whisper. "Yep," Jack said. "It's not glamorous, but it keeps the lights on, literally." Emma giggled, then hugged his arm. "It smells like socks." He laughed, and for a moment the world felt lighter. By mid-morning, Jack was replacing ceiling tiles in the third-floor break room, while Emma sat on a bench nearby, drawing quietly with the crayons he always kept in his backpack just in case. Upstairs, Ava was walking through the corridor with a tablet in hand, reviewing supply budgets, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Her assistant, Kayla, trailed behind, relaying the agenda for the upcoming board meeting. As they turned a corner, Ava stopped abruptly. Through the open door of the break room, she caught a glimpse of a small girl in a purple jacket seated alone, scribbling colorful shapes across printer paper. And sitting beside her arms, deep in a ceiling panel, was Jack. Kayla continued walking, oblivious. Ava stayed. For a moment, she simply watched. She hadn't expected this, hadn't even known Jack had a child. But as she observed the gentle glance he gave Emma every few seconds and the quiet, confident way the girl moved in his orbit, something within her stirred. Emma looked up and saw her. Ava blinked. The child stared at her for a beat, curious but not afraid. Then she lifted her crayon and offered a small wave. Ava, surprised by her own reaction, lifted her fingers in return. "Hi, Emma," mouthed silently. "Hi, Ava," said back her voice barely audible. Jack finally noticed and turned. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between apology and tension. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping down from the ladder. "Our sitter had an emergency. I didn't want to miss work." Ava didn't scold. Instead, she stepped closer, studying Emma, who was now holding up her drawing proudly. "Is this yours?" Ava asked. Emma nodded. "It's a city, but nicer, with no traffic." Jack cleared his throat. "We can head out." "No need," Ava interrupted softly. She turned to Emma. "I like your imagination." Then to Jack, more quietly. "She's beautiful." "How old, 9?" he said, cautious. "She reminds me of someone," Ava murmured. Then she smiled as if catching herself. "Let me know if you need a more private space next time." Jack blinked. "Thank you. That means a lot." She nodded, gave Emma one more warm glance, then turned and left without another word. But the moment lingered. Later that evening, as they walked home through soft flurries of snow, Emma tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Was that lady your boss?" "Yes." "She's pretty," Jack chuckled. "She's also very smart and busy." She looked kind of sad. Emma said, her voice thoughtful. Jack stopped walking. "Sad," he repeated. Emma nodded, like her heart had a Band-Aid on it. Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he lifted her onto his shoulders and continued down the sidewalk, the wind carrying the scent of roasted peanuts from a street cart nearby. Sometimes, he said, even strong people have parts that still hurt. That night, Ava stood in her penthouse overlooking a city lit in gold and silver. A wine glass sat untouched beside her. On the table was the drawing Emma had left behind. Kayla had retrieved it after they'd gone. A city, with no traffic, a river running through the center, bridges made of flowers. She turned it over. On the back, in blocky handwriting, it read, "For Daddy, because he makes broken things better." Ava stared at it until her eyes blurred. She remembered her father, how he used to fix broken watches, taking them apart and putting them back together without manuals. She remembered how he stopped doing that after her mother left, as if the world had broken in a way he couldn't fix. She'd built everything this company, her reputation, her fortress of solitude, on the belief that no one would catch her if she fell. But someone had, and now she had seen the man who caught her not just in the act of saving a life, but in the act of quietly living for someone else. Emma wasn't just a child. She was his why. And Ava was starting to wonder if she'd ever had one of those for herself. She placed the drawing gently on her desk. Maybe it wasn't just Jack she needed to understand. Maybe it was time to learn what it meant to fix things that weren't machines, like people, like trust, like herself, and maybe like someone else's tomorrow. The storm had returned overnight, cloaking Manhattan in a curtain of snow by morning. But Ava Whitmore didn't notice the weather. She stood in her office, perfectly still, the silence so complete that the faint tick of the antique clock on her bookshelf sounded like a drumbeat in her ear. On her desk, a flash drive lay next to her laptop like a live wire. She had waited nearly 2 weeks for the city's Department of Transportation to release the footage, had pulled strings signed, waivers even met in person with the assistant commissioner. A request like this wasn't common. But then Ava Whitmore was no ordinary citizen. She sat down, inserted the drive, and opened the folder. Her breath caught the moment the file loaded. Timestamp, 11:52 p.m. Location, FDR Drive near South Street. Weather heavy snow. Camera fixed, traffic unit 04-7. She hit play. At first, there was nothing, just the ghostly sheen of headlights flickering through snow and the empty icy road below. Then a flash. A vehicle veered sharply from the left lane, spun, and slammed into the guardrail with a metallic shriek even the mute recording seemed to carry. Her SUV. She watched her own accident unfold like a scene from someone else's nightmare. The next 10 seconds were a void. No movement, no bystanders. The snow thickened. Then, suddenly, there he was. A man running from the shadows silhouetted by his own headlights. He sprinted to the wreck, yanked at the passenger door. Nothing. He circled to the driver's side, crouched, pried, pulled until the door gave. The man leaned inside, bracing himself against the frame. Ava leaned forward, one hand over her mouth. The angle didn't show his face clearly, but she didn't need it. The posture, the shape, the urgency. It was Jack. He pulled her out slowly, carefully, as if she were made of glass. Then he collapsed onto the snow with her in his arms. His jacket came off, wrapped around her shoulders. He checked her pulse, held her face, murmured something they couldn't hear. Then he stood and left. No ambulance, no police yet. He simply walked away into the night. Ava sat frozen as the screen faded to black. A knock on the glass pulled her from the trance. Kayla stood at the door. "I didn't mean to interrupt. The 10 a.m. was pushed to noon. And Mr. Sloan is asking for, I'll handle him later," Ava said softly. Kayla glanced at the screen, recognized the paused image. Her eyes widened. "Is that?" "Yes." Kayla stepped closer. "You were right. It was him." Ava nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. "He never told me." "Why would he?" Ava looked down. "Because he saved my life." Kayla hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Maybe that's exactly why he didn't. That afternoon, Jack was in the mechanical control room tracing a glitch in the security access panel logs. The fluorescent lights above flickered with that peculiar stutter they always did when a snowstorm passed through. He was halfway through testing a relay switch when a voice came from behind. "I see you still fix things yourself." He turned. Ava stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable but far gentler than usual. No tablet, no phone, just her. "I try," Jack said, standing. "What can I help you with?" She stepped inside. "Actually, I came to say something, and I didn't want to do it over email or in a hallway." Jack wiped his hands and waited. "I know it was you," she said. "That night. The crash." He didn't move, didn't deny it, just held her gaze. "I requested the traffic footage," she added. "I needed to see it with my own eyes. And now I have." Jack looked down, exhaled slowly. "I didn't think you'd remember." "I remembered your voice first," she said. "Then your hands. The way you spoke to me. Calm. Like you'd done it before." "I haven't," he said quietly. She nodded. "That's what makes it even more incredible." Silence settled between them like snowfall, gentle but weighted. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked. Jack leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Because you didn't need to know. You were okay. That's all I cared about." Ava studied him, then said, "That's not how people work in this city." Jack gave a half smile. "I guess I missed the memo." She chuckled, soft and unguarded, and for a moment it felt like the air between them warmed. "I owe you my life," Ava said. "And I don't say that lightly. Not just as a woman, but as someone who hasn't needed anyone for a long time." Jack looked at her, something flickering in his eyes. "You don't owe me anything. But if I'm being honest, maybe I needed that night as much as you did." She tilted her head. "Why? Because I'd forgotten what it feels like to make a difference. To matter. That moment. It reminded me." Ava's throat tightened. She stepped closer, voice quiet. "You mattered long before that night, Jack. I just didn't see it." Their eyes locked. The room, the building, the city outside, it all fell away for a breathless second. And though nothing was said aloud, something between them shifted. Recognition. Respect. Something tender. Ava broke the moment with a gentle nod. "There's a corporate event next Friday. Black tie, board members, speeches. Most people will be faking smiles and swapping business cards." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Sounds riveting." She smiled. "I want you to come." He blinked. "Me as my guest," she said. "Not as a favor. Not because of the past. But because maybe it's time the people in that room met someone real." Jack didn't answer right away, but then quietly he said, "I'll think about it." Ava nodded, then turned to leave. And just before stepping through the door, she looked over her shoulder. "Thank you, Jack, for that night, and for not walking away." Then she was gone, and Jack was left standing in the hum of wires and lights, heart pounding not because of what had happened, but because of what might just be beginning. The invitation sat on Jack's kitchen table for 3 days before he even touched it again. Thick, cream-colored cardstock, the Whitmore Industries logo embossed in gold at the top. Below it, annual corporate reception. Whitmore Tower Grand Ballroom. Formal attire required. He turned it over slowly in his hands as Emma ate cereal beside him, her eyes darting between her spoon and her father. "Are you going to go?" Jack looked up. "To what, that fancy party thing?" she said, clearly eavesdropping. "You keep looking at the envelope like it's going to bite you." He chuckled. "You think I'd fit in there?" Emma tilted her head. "Do they have food?" "Probably." "Then yes." He laughed, but there was a weight behind his smile. It wasn't the dress code or the glitz that unsettled him. It was the idea of walking into that room as her guest. That phrase alone invited 100 interpretations, and none of them sat comfortably with him. Because no matter what Ava said or how she looked at him that day in the control room, Jack still felt like a man on the outside of something too polished, too precise. By the time Friday arrived, Jack had made his decision, if only because Emma had helped pick out a tie, and Mrs. Rivera insisted on ironing his one decent jacket while humming old Sinatra tunes. "You walk into that room with your head high," she said. "The people worth knowing will see who you are. And the rest, they don't matter. He'd nodded, grateful, but a part of him still questioned what Ava really wanted from him. Gratitude. A story, a headline for her board, or something more dangerous connection. The Whitmore ballroom shimmered beneath a canopy of crystal lights and live-string music. Waiters in black ties glided across the floor with silver trays. Industry titans shook hands like they were brokering peace treaties. And at the far end of the room, near a grand staircase, stood Ava Whitmore. She was dressed in a midnight blue gown that was understated but unmistakably elegant. Her hair swept into a soft chignon, her only jewelry a thin silver bracelet that caught the light when she turned her wrist. Yet it wasn't any of that that made Jack pause as he entered. It was her eyes. She saw him across the room before anyone else did, and for a moment the noise dulled. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, but the warmth in her gaze was undeniable, like she was relieved he came. A junior executive approached Jack quickly. "Sir, can I see your invite?" Jack held it up. The man glanced at it, then at Jack's well-worn jacket and scuffed shoes. His polite smile faltered. "Oh, you're Miss Whitmore's guest." Before Jack could reply, Ava was already at his side. "Jack," she said, voice calm and clear. "Glad you made it." The junior exec paled slightly and backed away. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Was that my first test?" "No," she said, her lips tugging upward. "That comes later." She offered her arm. He hesitated, then took it. The evening blurred into conversation and introductions. Ava moved through the crowd like water fluid, poised, commanding. And Jack, despite himself, found he didn't want to leave her side. Not because he was dazzled by the event, but because next to her he felt seen. Still, not everyone shared Ava's perspective. Across the room, Gregory Sloane watched them with narrowed eyes, his scotch glass tight in his grip. He'd spent the last 2 weeks digging through Jack Carter's file, convinced there was a missing piece. No man got that close to Ava professionally or personally without a reason. And tonight, Jack had shown up not just as a guest, but on her arm. Unacceptable. Gregory approached just as Ava stepped away to speak to a board member. Jack stood alone for the first time in an hour, scanning the room. Gregory moved in. "Jack Carter, isn't it?" he asked, tone like a blade wrapped in velvet. Jack nodded. "That's me. Gregory Sloane, COO. He offered his hand. Jack shook it. "I've been meaning to chat," Gregory continued. "You've made quite the impression lately." Jack sensed something cold beneath the civility. "Just doing my job. That's what concerns me." Jack blinked. "Excuse me. You see, we have a culture here. Processes. Protocols. And I find it troubling when someone leaps over all of them and lands in a senior position without so much as a second interview." Jack folded his arms. "I didn't leap anywhere. I was hired." Gregory's voice dropped. "You were selected. By Ava. Personally. That kind of decision carries weight and consequences." There was no threat in the words, and yet it felt like one. Jack didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for special treatment." "No," Gregory said, stepping closer, "but you're standing in a room full of people who think you did." Before Jack could respond, Ava reappeared. "Gregory," she said, eyes flashing. "I see you've met Jack." "We were just chatting," he said smoothly, but Jack could tell she heard the undertone. Ava placed a hand on Jack's arm. "Excuse us." She led him to the edge of the ballroom near the balcony. The night air filtered in through open doors, crisp and sharp. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "He shouldn't have cornered you." "He's not wrong," Jack said. "People are talking. Wondering why I'm here. Why you brought me." She looked up at him. "Do you wonder?" Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but I wonder if you do." The question hung between them. "I brought you," she said slowly, "because I trust you. Because you remind me of who I wanted to be before all of this." He searched her face, surprised by the vulnerability. "And because," she added, "you're the only person in this room who doesn't want anything from me." Jack exhaled. The wind caught his tie, fluttered it against his chest. "I came because Emma said I should," he admitted. Ava smiled, eyes soft. "Smart girl." They stood in silence for a long moment, side by side, watching the city lights burn beneath them. Not rivals, not strangers, just two people worn but alive on the edge of something neither fully understood yet. And, for the first time, Ava didn't feel like she had to control what came next. She just had to trust it. The Monday after the reception dawned with a clear sky, crisp air, and the distinct chill of judgment lingering beneath polished smiles. Jack arrived earlier than usual, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because he needed to be grounded. After the whirlwind of Friday night of standing beside Ava under chandeliers and scrutiny, the hum of machinery and the metallic scent of tools were a relief. He was halfway through tightening a boiler valve in the sub-basement when Luke found him. "You're officially famous," Luke said. Arms crossed, a teasing edge in his voice. Jack looked up. "I assume you're not talking about my pipe work." Luke handed him a folded copy of the Morning Ledger. On the front page was a photo taken at the Whitmore reception. Ava in her evening gown, Jack beside her, slightly turned mid-laugh. The caption read, "The CEO and the Mystery Man." A new power duo at Whitmore. Jack exhaled slowly. "I didn't even see a camera," he muttered. "Doesn't matter," Luke said. "You stood next to Ava Whitmore in front of 24 board members, half the city's business elite, and Gregory Sloane's worst dreams. Someone was bound to snap a photo." Jack handed the paper back. "Let me guess, Gregory's not thrilled." "Thrilled," Luke scoffed. "He's in war mode." Jack's stomach tightened. He had expected gossip, but not headlines. Upstairs, Ava sat at the head of the conference table in the executive boardroom. The temperature in the room was cold, though the heating system worked just fine. Around her sat a collection of men in tailored suits and calculated frowns. Gregory Sloane paced at the end of the room, arms folded, voice low but cutting. "I have to ask Ava, what exactly are we doing?" Ava looked up from her tablet, calm and composed. "Clarify your question. You brought a maintenance technician to a black tie board event," Gregory said. "You gave him access to our executive tier. Now we're on page 1 of the ledger like we're filming a soap opera." A board member spoke up. "The investors are calling. They want to know if there's a personal entanglement that compromises judgment." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Are we really pretending that male executives haven't brought personal guests to that same event for years?" Jack wore a tie. He didn't ask for a spotlight. "But you gave him one," Gregory snapped. Silence. Then Ava leaned forward, her voice even but steely. "You're all missing the point. You're looking at optics headlines. I'm looking at integrity. That man Jack Carter pulled me out of a burning car and walked away without telling a soul. He works harder than half the people on this floor. He doesn't network. He doesn't manipulate. And that scares you because it's the one thing you can't control." Several men shifted in their seats. Gregory's jaw flexed. "He doesn't belong here." Ava's voice was razor sharp. "Then maybe we need to reconsider who does." Down in the facility corridor, Jack was checking heat differentials in the core HVAC system when his employee badge suddenly failed to open the next sector door. He tried again. Nothing. Frowning, he called up the building's access panel. His clearance had been revoked. Before he could react, Luke came jogging up the hallway. "They pulled your security," Luke said, breath short. It came from upstairs. Orders from Sloane's office. Something about a temporary review. Jack's jaw clenched. "So I'm being iced out." "They didn't even notify you?" Luke asked. Jack shook his head. "No, of course not." By noon, Jack had packed his tools and was sitting in the back stairwell with a lukewarm coffee trying to make sense of the last 72 hours. He had never asked to be elevated, never expected invitations, headlines, or receptions. All he'd done was tell the truth and do his job. And now it seemed that was too threatening for people like Gregory Sloane. A knock on the metal door pulled him from his thoughts. Ava stepped inside, coat still buttoned from an outside meeting. She looked tired but fierce. "I just came from the board," she said, voice calm but heavy. "They're circling." Jack rose to his feet. "I figured. They've suspended your system access pending a re-evaluation of internal structure." "It's not a termination." "Yet." Jack's brow furrowed. "You can override it." "I did. Twice." Sloan reinstated the lock. "He's manipulating procedure." "I don't want you to fight for me," Jack said gently but firmly. "This isn't your battle." "It is," Ava said. "Because I brought you into this mess. Because this company needs men like you more than it needs 10 Gregory Sloans." Jack shook his head. "I don't belong in the middle of a corporate power game, Ava. I'm not built for politics. I'm built for boilers and wiring and Emma." She stepped closer. "That's why you belong. Because you know why you're here. And I'm not asking you to play a game. I'm asking you not to walk away from something that matters." Jack's voice dropped. "Do you really believe I'm the one being tested here?" Ava didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "Maybe we both are." They stood in silence, tension and tenderness swirling between them like storm winds against glass. Then Ava reached into her coat and handed him a sealed envelope. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting on Friday. I want you there." Jack hesitated. "Why?" "Because I'm not going to defend your presence behind closed doors anymore," she said. "If they want answers, they can hear them from you." He opened the envelope. Inside was a formal summons with his name on it. Jack looked at her quiet and steady. "I don't like attention," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why they need to hear your voice." That night, Jack returned home to find Emma asleep on the couch with her rabbit tucked under her chin and a drawing on the table. It was a picture of him in a suit standing in front of a tall building with stars drawn above his head. In crayon, she had written, "You're a hero, Daddy, even if nobody knows it yet." Jack sat beside her, stared at the drawing for a long time, and whispered, "They're about to." Friday morning arrived wrapped in silence. Jack stood in front of the mirror buttoning the collar of the same dress shirt he wore to the interview weeks ago. It had been ironed again, this time by Mrs. Rivera, who'd said nothing but patted his arm and left a folded note inside his jacket pocket. The truth doesn't need permission. Emma peeked from the bedroom doorway, hugging her rabbit. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Jack turned to her and nodded. "A little." She stepped closer, slipping something into his hand. A small folded square of paper with a drawing of him stick figure toolbox in one hand, a glowing star above his head. "Heroes don't have to yell," she whispered. Jack swallowed hard and hugged her tight. At Whitmore Tower, the air on the 30th floor was razor thin. Ava sat at the head of the long mahogany table, every board member in place, their expressions carefully curated into neutrality. The walls were glass, the city stretching out behind them like a silent jury. Gregory Sloan sat directly opposite Ava, fingers steepled a faint smirk playing on his lips. His message had been clear all week. "You brought him in. Now let's see you defend him." Ava stood as Jack entered. No suit. Just a button-down, clean jeans boots polished as best he could. He looked out of place in the room, but somehow also the most grounded person there. Ava gestured to the seat beside her. Mr. Carter said Gregory without looking up. "This isn't a disciplinary hearing, to be clear. This is simply a clarification of roles, ensuring we're aligned on company culture and expectations." Jack took his seat calmly. "Happy to clarify." A chuckle rose from the far end of the table. "You certainly made an impression." Gregory leaned forward. "The concern, frankly, is influence. Optics. A senior employee being fast-tracked under executive favor raises questions." Jack met his gaze evenly. "I was hired after one interview because your CEO saw something in me. Not because I asked for anything. I've shown up. I've worked. I've kept my head down. If that's what bothers you, I don't think I'm the one with something to explain." A few brows lifted. One board member scribbled something in her notebook. "Let's be honest," Mr. Carter said. "Gregory, you were the man in the photo. That image suggested closeness, not professionalism. Jack sat forward. You want to talk about the photo? Fine, but let's talk about the moment before it was taken. He looked at each person around the table. She invited me because I saved her life. On a street in the snow when nobody else stopped. I didn't know her name. I didn't know who she was. I didn't care. I did it because I believe in doing what's right even when nobody's watching. A hush fell over the room. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't use it to get a job or leverage or favors. I came here because I need work. I have a daughter. I fix things pipes, wiring, machines. It's what I do. He paused. But I think you're afraid I might fix something else. Something deeper. Like how we treat people who can't talk their way into rooms like this. Ava didn't move, but her chest rose with a slow breath. Gregory narrowed his eyes. You're implying we're broken. Jack stood. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying that when leadership stops recognizing integrity just because it comes in a worn jacket instead of a tailored suit, then yes, something's broken. No one interrupted him. And if what makes someone a threat here is not wanting anything but to do the job well, then maybe I'm in the wrong place. He turned to Ava. Unless I'm not. She looked up at him steady. You're not. Jack nodded once. Then you'll know where to find me. He walked toward the door, his steps even. For a moment it felt like no one breathed. Just before exiting, Jack turned back. For what it's worth, he added, voice quieter now. I don't belong here to make noise. I'm here to make sure when people turn on the lights they stay on. Then he left. Silence held the boardroom in a suspended state. Then a woman from the far end of the table, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, spoke. I've been on this board 22 years, she said. That's the first time anyone in this room reminded me why we exist. Several others nodded slowly. Gregory looked shaken but forced a smile. Well, perhaps that's enough drama for one morning. No, Ava said, rising to her feet. Not yet. She faced them all standing tall. Jack Carter is not a symbol. He's not a headline. He's a reminder that we've strayed too far from the people who make this company run. She glanced around. Today isn't about Jack proving he belongs. It's about us proving we deserve to keep him. Then, without waiting for consensus, she collected her files. Meeting adjourned. That evening, Jack returned home exhausted but lighter. Emma greeted him at the door with her newest drawing, a tower glowing with stars and a small figure in a hard hat at the base. This is your building now, she said proudly, because you're the one who keeps the lights on. Jack knelt and pulled her into his arms. Maybe she was right. Maybe all along what made someone belong wasn't who they knew or what they wore, but what they stood for. And today, he had stood. For something. For himself. For everyone like him. And the light stayed on. The sun poured into Ava's office through tall windows casting long golden stripes across the polished floor. It was the first truly warm morning of the year, the kind of light that made glass buildings feel like greenhouses and reminded people there was still life outside quarterly reports. But Ava Whitmore felt nothing of it. She sat at her desk, the boardroom transcript open in front of her fingers, laced under her chin. The room was quiet, too quiet. Even the ever-present buzz of Kayla's typing outside the glass wall was absent. In truth, she was waiting. She'd dismissed her entire morning schedule. She needed space. Not to make a decision she already had, but to feel the full weight of it before she acted. Downstairs, Jack was back in the boiler room, wrench in hand, repairing a broken valve he could have fixed in his sleep. But his hands worked more slowly today. Not from hesitation, but reflection. The boardroom confrontation had been 3 days ago, and still the tension lingered in the walls. People looked at him differently now, some with respect, others with wariness, and a few with something closer to resentment. But what mattered most was that he looked at himself differently. He had stood his ground, and, surprisingly, the world hadn't fallen apart. Yet he couldn't shake the sense that Ava was still fighting battles he hadn't been invited to see. And maybe that was about to change. Ava finally rose from her chair and walked to the window. Below, the city was moving brisk, oblivious, alive. She thought about everything that had brought her here: the accident, the fire, the rescue, the quiet man who had slipped away without expecting anything, and then walked back into her life through a door she hadn't even known she'd left open. For years, she had told herself leadership meant solitude, distance, iron discipline. But Jack had reminded her of something else: that integrity had nothing to do with power and loyalty didn't have to be bought. She reached for the folder on her desk. Inside it was the proposal for a new corporate initiative, something Jack had unknowingly inspired. A partnership between Whitmore Industries and the city's underfunded trade schools. Technical apprenticeships, paid internships, real pathways for people like Jack and the many others who wouldn't otherwise be seen. She'd named the initiative the Second Light Program, because Jack hadn't just turned on a switch in her building. He'd turned one on inside her. Later that afternoon, Ava appeared in the facility's office without warning. Jack looked up from his workbench, surprised. "You're early," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "I canceled my meetings," she said. "Needed to see someone who doesn't pretend for a living." He chuckled. "You'll get me in trouble with your PR team." She handed him a folder. "I want you to read this." He opened it, scanned the first page, then looked up sharply. "This is your idea." "It's yours," she said. "You just didn't pitch it." He flipped the page, absorbing details. Vocational partnerships, full healthcare coverage for entry-level roles, a mentorship program. "I want you to head it," Ava added. "You'd stay in facilities, but with an expanded title: Director of Infrastructure Development. Full authority to build the program from the ground up." Jack stared at her, stunned. "You're serious?" "As a rebuilt firewall," she replied. He didn't laugh. Not yet. Instead, he set the folder down and looked at her closely. "Why me? Because this company needs a moral compass, and because I trust you more than I trust anyone on the 31st floor." Jack was quiet for a long beat. Then, "You're going to take heat for this." "I already have," she said. "But some choices you make for survival, others for legacy." Jack exhaled. "You really think I can do this?" "I don't promote people because of their resumes," she said softly. "I promote them because of what they do when no one's watching." His gaze softened. "And this," she added, her voice quieter now, "isn't about repaying a debt. It's about building something better. Together." The word lingered in the air. Together. Not just as colleagues, not just as leaders, but as people who had walked through fire in different ways and had chosen not to be hardened by it. That evening, Jack and Emma took a walk through Central Park. Spring was peeking through the ground patches of green shy crocuses and puddles that reflected the sky. Emma skipped ahead, arms wide. "Daddy, watch me fly," Jack smiled. "You already are." He'd told her about the new job, about how things might change: more meetings, more responsibilities, but also more chances to help people who needed someone to believe in them. "Will I still get to see you in the morning?" she had asked. "You'll always see me," he said. Maybe not always in boots and tools, but always. Now walking behind her, he saw the future more clearly than he ever had. Not just a better paycheck, not just restored dignity, but the power to build something lasting for her and for all the kids like her whose parents were trying to hold on with scraped knuckles and quiet courage. Back in her penthouse, Ava watched the city lights flicker to life. Across the street, in another high-rise, someone was replacing a bulb on a rooftop sign. She smiled. The lights stayed on, because someone like Jack was still out there, fixing things no one noticed, and, finally, being seen. It was after hours at Whitmore Tower, the city below softened by twilight, and the building itself unusually quiet, almost reverent. The hum of conversation, the clack of heels, the buzz of conference calls all had faded into a peaceful stillness, as if the tower were taking a breath at the end of a long day. On the 32nd floor in the executive wing, Ava rarely used, one office remained lit. Jack stood inside, sleeves rolled up, a notepad in one hand, the other resting lightly on a scale model of the new training center he was designing. On his laptop screen, a spreadsheet of budget projections shared space with a childlike drawing tacked to the corner, a stick figure holding a light bulb smiling under a caption in block letters, "My dad fixes the world." He smiled softly. Still here came a voice behind him. He turned. Ava leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed but relaxed. She wasn't in her usual suit. Instead, she wore a soft navy sweater and jeans, her hair loose, face unguarded. For the first time, she looked less like a CEO and more like Ava. Jack nodded. Couldn't sleep. "The electricians are finalizing specs on the Bronx site. We break ground next month." "I know," she said. "I approved the final permits this morning." He set the pad down. "You're here late." "So are you." He gave a small chuckle. "I guess we're both bad at leaving things unfinished." Ava stepped into the room and walked toward the window. The skyline stretched out before them, lit with 1,000 warm lights. Below, cars moved like veins through the city's circulatory system, constant, driven alive. "This place looks different at night," she said. Jack joined her at the glass. "It always does. That's when you notice what's really lit and what's just pretending." She glanced at him, thoughtful. "Funny how many things we passed by without ever really seeing." He nodded. "Until they break." They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching the city breathe. Then Ava spoke again, softer now. "I've spent most of my career building walls so nothing could touch me. I thought it made me strong." "It made you survive," Jack said gently. She looked at him. "And then you showed up. Quiet. No ask. No agenda. Just hands that helped. A voice that calmed." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. "You reminded me that strength isn't about how much you carry, it's about who you carry it for." Jack swallowed hard. "I carried you out of that car. But you gave me a reason to keep walking." A long pause. Then Ava reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. She opened her palm. Jack blinked. "His old scarf. You never came back for it," she said, smiling. He laughed softly, taking it from her. "I thought it was lost." She met his eyes. It wasn't. A week later, the city gathered for the ribbon cutting of the Second Light Training Center, a sprawling, modern space in the Bronx where veterans, single parents, immigrants, and trade school graduates would learn from experienced technicians and gain pathways into careers like Jack's. Ava gave the opening remarks. But Jack delivered the speech everyone remembered. He stood before a crowd of students, board members, donors, and media, with Emma, perched in the front row, legs crossed and proud. He didn't speak from a teleprompter. He spoke from his life. "I never thought I'd stand behind a microphone," he began. "But I've stood behind broken panels, busted boilers, and lights that refused to turn on. And I've learned that the most important thing isn't knowing how to fix something. It's believing that fixing it is worth the effort. When people are given the tools, the time, and someone who sees their potential, they rise. This center isn't about charity. It's about opportunity. The woman who helped build this with me, she gave me a second light. And now we want to pass that light forward." The applause rose warm and sincere, and Emma clapped loudest. Afterward, as cameras clicked and people shook hands, Ava found Jack beneath a simple overhead lamp on the center's main floor. "It worked," she said. Jack smiled. "Yeah," and the lights stayed on. That night, the two of them sat on the center's rooftop garden, the city pulsing below them. Emma had fallen asleep inside on a beanbag, a book open in her lap. The stars above peeked through the haze of light pollution, faint but persistent. Jack leaned back, hands behind his head. "I used to think the world didn't need men like me," he said quietly, "that we were invisible, disposable." "You're not," Ava said. "I know that now." She looked at him. "What changed?" He turned to her. "You didn't walk away." For a long moment they simply sat in that truth. Then Ava took his hand, threading her fingers with his. Not urgently, not possessively, just Surely. I think she whispered, "This is how healing begins." He nodded eyes on the distant glow of downtown. "And how stories begin," he added. "No," she said, resting her head on his shoulder, "how the right ones continue." Months later, Emma placed a framed photo on her nightstand. It was of her dad and Ava in hard hats standing under a newly lit sign, Second Light Training Center. She turned off her lamp and whispered, "Good night, world." And in the darkness, the building across the city blinked back. The light was still on, because someone chose to stay, and someone else finally chose to let him in.